Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Trevor Brothers. I'm a research fellow at Tufts University in the United States, and I'm really excited to be introducing the next installment in this awesome speaker series brought to you by Oberlin ao Vivo and the Brazilian Linguistics Association. The whole idea of this speaker series is to provide free access to state-of-the-art discussions about language and linguistics. And today I'm particularly happy to be introducing Dr. Matthew Traxler. In addition to being a friend and mentor of mine, Dr. Traxler is a full professor at the University of California at Davis and is affiliated with the UC Davis Center for Mind and Brain. Matt has made a number of important contributions to our understanding of language comprehension, including for syntactic ambiguity resolution, complement coercion, our understanding of individual differences in sentence processing. And Dr. Traxler is also the author of an important textbook, The Introduction to Psycholinguistics, which is used by classrooms all over the world. Today, Matt is going to be talking to us about the flexibility of predictive processing during comprehension. And again, thank you all for joining us. Remember, both on YouTube and on the Oberlin website, feel free to enter any questions you have in the chat window. And at the end of the presentation, we'll hopefully be able to get to a lot of those questions and have an interesting discussion. So thank you, and take it away, Matt.
Thank you, Trevor. I'm very excited to be here with you today. Very honored to have the invitation to speak in this forum. I think this is a wonderful wonderful advantage of our recent experience with the pandemic is we've figured out that we can actually reach out to people virtually and make a connection. So I'm really excited to be a part of this speaker series and want to thank the group for the invitation. So the plan today is I have some slides prepared, and I'm quite happy to talk about the research that we've done in our lab, but I'm also quite happy to have this be a more informal discussion. So as Trevor indicated, if at any time you have a question, please pop into the chat. We can run this as a discussion if people would prefer. Okay, and as Trevor mentioned, if you know my work, it's probably because you've had some exposure either to the Handbook of Psycholinguistics or the textbook that I wrote, Introduction to Psycholinguistics. And I'm particularly excited because the textbook was reviewed by the philosopher Kierkegaard, and here's what Kierkegaard had to say about the book. He says, overall, an interesting introduction. Some chapters were much more interesting to me than others, which were somewhere between kind of boring and boring. So I'll take that at endorsement and appreciate that people took the time to read it and comment. For today's talk, I thought we could usefully focus on some issues relating to prediction or anticipatory processing in language, and I'm particularly glad that Trevor's here with us today. He's done some great work in the area of anticipation and language, and so the research questions that I'm addressing today are things that Trevor has worked on over the years. So for today's talk, I'd like to focus us on three basic questions. First, how and when do listeners and readers make predictions about upcoming language stimuli? I think there's a developing consensus in the psycholinguistic community that people certainly are capable and do oftentimes make predictions about aspects of language stimuli that they have yet to encounter. But the consensus around the fact that it happens doesn't really explain to us how it happens. And so I think there's an additional question there that should be addressed. A lot of the work on anticipatory processing in language has focused on word level phenomena. So much of the talk today sort of assumes that that's the level of processing that we're talking about. And so we can ask the question, what factors are contributing to the processing difficulty for words, and how does anticipation or prediction feed into that? And then finally, an important question that we've addressed in our lab is how readers and listeners make use of contextual information during predictive processing. And in particular, we've identified context at different scales. So local context, essentially a few words prior to a target word, or information contained within the same sentence. We think of that as local context. And we think about that differently from global context, which could be the context of a discourse or the context of a dialogue. So local context, we think, is restricted to information in near proximity to a target word. Global information, we're going to define as information from the wider context, the extrasentential context. Okay, the notions around anticipatory processing have been getting a lot of airplay in psycholinguistics recently, and many prominent accounts now that are explaining anticipatory processing appeal to Bayesian information-theoretic concepts. And when you boil these things down, one of the essential properties is the Bayesian approaches assert or predict that the processing load or difficulty associated with a given word is going to be a function of the predictability of that word. And there's a whole bunch of different theorists who have developed versions of this kind of account. John Hale was one of the first people to come out with a Bayesian approach to sentence processing. And this is a summary of one of the core features of his account. So he's arguing that the probability of a given word in a string, nth word in the string, is a probability over all of that word conditioned on aspects of the local context. So this is exactly in line with Bayes' theorem, which says that the probability of any given event is a function of two things. One is the base rate likelihood of that event, and then there's the conditional probability with some other set of information taken into consideration. That simple framework is very useful in analyzing certain experimental results. And one of the seminal results in this area was Jerry Altmann and Yuki Kamide's experiment using the visual world paradigm. Visual world paradigm uses usually head-mounted eye tracking, could be fixed eye tracking, and people simultaneously listen to some expression in language as they are exposed to an array of visual objects in the display. And the question that Jerry and Yuki were asking is, does comprehender's attention shift to objects prior to those objects actually being named or labeled in the linguistic expression itself? So they contrasted two kinds of sentences, one of which contained a verb that has very loose selection restrictions, and one of which has much tighter selection restrictions. So there are many, many more things that we can move compared to the things that we can eat. And the research question here is, if you are listening to the boy will move versus the boy will eat, will you use the verb information to direct your attention to relevant objects in the display prior to actually encountering a target? And that is, in fact, exactly what they found. So when people were listening to these kinds of sentences, a sentence that had a stronger restriction in terms of likely subsequent reference, those verbs were driving people's eye movements to a appropriate target in a display well before people even heard the beginning of the noun phrase, the cake. And so Altmann and Kamide concluded that as people are listening to language, we are using cues from the context to anticipate likely future objects or likely future entities, concepts that are going to be mentioned. And this kicked off a whole raft of visual world experiments along similar lines. But that's not the only kind of evidence that we can point to support the idea that people are using contextual information to anticipate future events. So Altmann and Kamide were focusing at the word level. Other studies have focused at the level of syntax in the processing system. One frequently cited study is by Fine and colleagues. And their basic idea was, if comprehenders are tracking statistics about syntactic structure, they can use those statistics to estimate the likelihood that a given string is going to continue in one syntactic structure versus another. To test that idea, they presented subjects with a whole sequence of sentences of a given type. And in this particular study, they used sentences that had reduced relative clauses. And these sentences tend to be difficult to process. And one explanation for that from the Bayesian point of view is that the beginning of the sentence leads you to anticipate one syntactic continuation, but in fact, the sentence continues in a different way, and that causes the system to be surprised. And in particular, the surprising part of these sentences is this little prepositional phrase, this by phrase, which is actually part of a reduced relative clause. So in the experiment, they had many of these reduced relative sentences interspersed with some other sentences that were of a simpler syntactic type. And the fundamental prediction was, the more of these kinds of surprising sentences that you process in the experiment, the easier they will be to deal with, because according to the Bayesian view, your estimate of the prior probability of this rare structure goes up. So you are more likely to anticipate that structure as you are exposed to more and more exemplars during the experiment. And in fact, that's what they found. So these are length corrected reading times from eye tracking experiment. And the tricky kind of sentences represented in blue, these are our reduced relatives. A control type of sentence, a main verb, simpler, more frequent sentence is represented in red. Trial order is represented on the x-axis. So we're tracking the course of the experiment as subjects are being exposed to more and more sentences of different types. And what Fine and colleagues showed is that compared to the beginning of the experiment, where the reduced relative sentences took a really long time to process, as people are being exposed to more and more sentences of this type, their reading times get much quicker. So by the end of the experiment, there's a much reduced difference in processing time between the reduced relative sentences and the control sentences, consistent with the idea that whatever processing system is engaged in syntactic analysis, it's updating its estimates of likelihood based on exposure to recent stimuli. Now, one might look at this pattern and say that is for sure consistent with the Bayesian approach. But as an experimental psycholinguist, I'm a little bit worried that we might be looking at a floor effect here. So we're not really comparing apples to apples here when we're comparing reduced relative sentences to main verb sentences. This experiment might have been more convincing if we had had two difficult sentence types, one of which was trained, one of which was not trained. And then you should see, according to the Bayesian view, an increasing advantage for the trained structure over the untrained structures. We don't have that here, but there are in fact some other studies that suggest that something like that might actually happen. So there's a long-term exposure study by a student of Mary Ellen McDonald's. There's also some work by Kashak and colleagues, mainly using acceptability judgments as the outcome measure. But both of those kinds of studies, the Wells and colleagues study use reading times Cash focuses chiefly on acceptability judgments, but both of them provide evidence that when you train people by exposing them to a particular sentence type, that type of sentence becomes easier to process over time, consistent with the Bayesian idea that we're updating our estimates of prior probability due to exposure. And so Trevor and I were interested in this issue of syntactic prediction. Just because a sentence gets easier to process with exposure doesn't necessarily mean that people are actively predicting upcoming syntactic constituents. So Trevor very cleverly designed a study to get at exactly that issue. Are people actually actively anticipating the syntactic structure that will appear in a given sentence? And the method we used here was eye tracking while reading. So we have an eye tracker in the basement of the psychology building at UC Davis, and we can use the eye tracker to present sentences to participants as we measure their eye movements. And in a typical sentence, people will fixate on about 90% of the content words, but every once in a while they'll skip a word. They don't need to directly fixate that word to identify it and incorporate it into their mental representation of the sentence. And generally speaking, when we see people skipping words, that's usually because people have either identified the word in the paraphobia, or it's possible that if they have predicted that word, there's no need to fixate it directly. So that's the framework that we're working in. And we used a specific version of eye tracking methodology that's called fast change preview manipulation. And that manipulation goes something like this. Before you present a target sentence like "the admiral would not confess to any of the charges," you can replace the critical word with something else as people are working their way up to that part of the sentence. So in this case, if the target sentence were this, "the admiral would not confess to any of the charges," we could have an identity preview condition where confess appears during the preview period, and then it also appears as people are fixating directly on this target word. But we can have other kinds of previews as well. So in this case, we had another condition, which we'll call the invalid preview condition, where during the preview period, the word surgeon appears in this location, later to be replaced by the target word. And then we had a word repetition condition where we took a word from the early part of the sentence. We used that as the preview. And then again, when people fixated this area directly, the preview word would disappear and the target word would appear. And in fact, we inserted a little invisible boundary into the stimuli. And during the early processing of the sentence, there's a preview word that's present in the target location. There's an invisible boundary here. The subjects can't see the boundary. It's just placed there in the software. And when the eye tracker detects that someone's eye fixation has crossed this invisible boundary, we replace the preview with the target. And again, in this experiment, we have three conditions: valid preview, a category incongruent or invalid preview, and then we have a word repetition preview. So during the preview period, you have either confess, surgeon, or admiral in the target location. When the eye crosses this invisible boundary, we change to the target, which is always "the admiral would not confess to any of the charges." The question here was whether the syntactic information about the preview word would impact people's likelihood of skipping the target word. If people are anticipating syntactic category information, they are going to predict a verb in this location. If they're previewed with a noun, that would seem to violate that prediction, and we would expect then that region to draw more fixations when we actually have the verb target. So we had a set of conditions that had verbs in target location, we had a second set of sentences that had nouns in the target condition, but the manipulation is the same. Either the preview is identity or it's from a different syntactic category. If people are anticipating future syntactic structure events, future syntactic categories, we'll get more skipping, more word skipping in the valid preview condition relative to the invalid preview condition. And that's in fact what Trevor's experiment showed. So here's experiment 1, where we have our 3 conditions. Here's the different category preview word produces fewer skips than the valid preview. Similarly, even if we repeat a word from earlier in the sentence where you'd think you might potentially get some identity priming effects, that would cause greater skipping. We don't see that. We still see a difference between the valid preview condition and the repetition condition. We ran a couple more versions of this experiment to try and replicate that initial result. And in the third one, we used a control condition where the preview word was from the same category as the target, but it was a different word. So if we had the admiral would not confess, the preview word would also be a verb, but it would be a different verb than the target. So it might be something like the admiral would not reply, that kind of thing. And there, we still saw a benefit of being in the same category. Okay, so the category preview is leading to increased skipping, suggesting lower processing load and more anticipation of syntactic form compared to the invalid condition. So that is evidence that people are anticipating the syntactic form of upcoming material in sentences. There's also, we've talked about word level prediction, talked a little bit about syntactic structure level prediction, and there's also a raft of evidence for event level prediction from older behavioral studies like Sue and Trebasso's work, looking at how character goal information influences processing times when texts express either achieved or unachieved goals. Characters describe personalities and stories can also impact the way people process information that's either consistent or inconsistent with the character's described personality. Those could be interpreted as effects of anticipation or prediction. They also could potentially, though, be interpreted as resulting from processes of integration. There's other behavior that's consistent with the Bayesian information-theoretic view of language processing. Frequency effects can be found all over the place in language processing studies. We even have a law, Zipf's law, that says the more frequent a word is, the less signal you need to express that word. Standard models of lexical access and word identification include frequency effects, and they account for them in various ways. Morton uses adjusted thresholds. Other models have different ways of dealing with frequency effects, but they're built into many different modeling systems, not just Bayesian information-theoretic models. And then finally, in terms of behavioral results, words that are more predictable in context are read faster and skipped more in the eye tracking literature. And again, there's a wide range of studies that all consistently point in that direction. Some of the references are down here if you're interested in this kind of thing. So that's all kind of clearing the brush, providing some of the evidence that people might appeal to support the idea that we are actively anticipating upcoming information while processing language at different levels, word, syntactic, event level. But I'm going to make an assertion, and I'm quite happy to have this assertion challenged if people are interested in doing that. I would argue that the Bayesian information-theoretic models, as they have been presented, these are fundamentally about pattern activations. They're fundamentally about recognizing something that you've seen before based on pattern of associations between recent context and the thing that you're looking at. What these models really are not about is they're not about the interpretation of meaning. So a Bayesian information theoretic implemented model does not build a representation of meaning. What it does is it activates some previously encountered representation based on some pattern of stored association and some algorithm that combines overall frequency information with some analysis of conditional probability and context. Right? So they're really not about meaning. And as a psycholinguist, that seems to me to be at least a little bit troubling if we think about what languages do and what languages are for. There's a strong tradition in linguistics and psycholinguistics that language is really about conveying meaning, or it's about communicating a speaker's intentions. Yes, patterns are involved in that enterprise, but the enterprise is much more than just the creation and expression of patterns. And so the Bayesian information-theoretic approaches, the way I think about them, they really stand in contrast to some of the classical approaches, especially in areas of things like discourse processing, where these models and these theoretical approaches are very much emphasizing meaning construction processes. So if you go back, for example, and you read Kinch's 1988 Psych Review paper where he describes a version of his construction integration model, he says the first problem we need to solve in modeling discourse processing is how knowledge is used in understanding the meaning of words in a discourse. So it's not all about activating information from long-term memory. It's not all about associations that have been formed. It's about active processes of constructing meaning from input based on the input itself and the knowledge that we have about the world. It's a very different, as I see, it's a very different theoretical stance than the Bayesian information theoretic approaches. Okay, and so we have a number of traditional accounts in psycholinguistics that are focused on activation of various kinds of information in the service of determining meaning of expressions. And what many of these approaches have in common is an internal architecture or an internal structure that has a set of processing events that we might describe as activation, selection, and integration. So in models of lexical access, word processing, the cohort model, for example, says that early on, when we're exposed to the early phonology of a word, we are activating information memory is resonating based on its association to those initial phonemes. That's the activation phase. Then at some point, the incoming phonology allows us to reduce the pattern of activation to a single viable word candidate. That candidate is then selected and integrated with prior context. And that prior context can be syntactic, semantic, or both. And the evidence for that comes from, for example, studies of shadowing tasks where people can very, very rapidly repeat what they hear in a sentence. And when they make mistakes, the mistakes that they make are consistent with both the syntactic and the semantic context. So Marsden and Wilson back in the 70s argued that our ability to do that, our ability to shadow, means that we are activating phonological and lexical information very, very quickly. We are selecting specific targets for integration, and then we're performing that integration. Otherwise, it's hard to explain the pattern of errors that he observed. In sentence processing, there are various syntactic parsing accounts, syntactic representation accounts that also have this aspect of activation and then selection. So Voss and Kempen's unification grammar, as people are processing sentences, they're activating syntactic representations. And in cases of syntactic ambiguity, they might activate more than one representation. And then there's a process of competition and selection so that we're left with one syntactic choice or one syntactic possibility after having activated a range of possible syntactic structures. Race-based parsing idea that I worked on for a while Roger Van Gompel and Martin Pickering, similarly argues for a stage of activation followed by a selection and integration period. And then, of course, in discourse and dialogue, the most prominent theories have this notion of early activation, then some selection, and then some integration. More than a one-step of processing in the models. And so here's a really old paper that we used to cite all the time, and I don't see it cited very much anymore. This is a paper by Tilm, Ross, and Kinch, and it illustrates, I think, this idea of there's an early epoch of processing followed by something else. And the early epoch of processing might be characterized as an activation period where information from long-term memory is resonating in response to incoming stimuli. But then there is additional work that has to take place in order to select from that resonating information and then take the thing that is selected and integrate it with the prior context. And this is not, so the punchline here, I think, is the result is not incompatible necessarily with a Bayesian approach, so long as we treat integration as a real cognitive process that is part of the interpretation story. So in this experiment, they embedded different target words and they presented them in the context of a particular sentence. So in this sentence, we have the townspeople were amazed to find that all the buildings had collapsed except the mint. And mint is a word that has more than one English. It can relate to or it can relate to candy. And what Tilm, and Kinch did is they presented different target words following this context sentence. Some of those target words were related to one meaning of the ambiguous word that was contextually appropriate, and the other target word was inappropriate in the context. In addition to those two conditions, they had a third condition where they tested people's response to a word that was related to a reasonable inference. So there's nothing in this sentence that says there was an earthquake. Nonetheless, if the buildings collapsed, except for the mint, one fairly reasonable cause for that is that there was an earthquake. So what Tilm, and Kinch theorized was that there was an early stage of processing that was characterized by something like automatic spreading activation resonance. And then there was a subsequent period of processing that was characterized by selection of specific meanings and then integration of those meanings with context and an inferencing stage where people could take what was literally present in the expression itself. They could apply their world knowledge to that and then generate inferences like, why did all the buildings fall down? Well, there must have been something like an earthquake. And so in this experiment, they're looking at response times to different target words, and they're tracking how people respond to these different target words over time. And they see different patterns of response over time, depending on what kind of word was being tested. So early in the epoch, anything that was associated with this ambiguous word, those representations were activated. And then they stayed pretty well activated across the epoch that they were interested in, up to about 1500 milliseconds post-target. Inference-related information had a slower rise and continued to rise throughout the epoch. So early on, you have both appropriate and inappropriate information that's just resonating because of the specific words that are present in the sentence itself. And then only later do you see the impact of other kinds of information that are based on semantic interpretation, like inferences. Okay? So we might assume, or we might assume on the basis of these kinds of results, that we really do have different kinds of processes playing out over different parts of the processing epoch. early on resonance, activation, later on something like integration and inference. Okay, so now I want to just spend a minute, because I'm a bit of a visual person, kind of contrasting visually how things might work in Bayesian information-theoretic processing worldview versus a more dialogue and discourse-based worldview. So in terms of what Bayesian information approaches do, they're really focused on activation of word-level information. So they're really focused on either lexical retrieval or word recognition, something like that. And in these models, the activation function is determined by word-level input, in particularly the frequency of different inputs has a relationship to the degree of activation that a representation of memory would have based on the input alone. And so this part is sort of like John Hale's priors. So the word level input really is an expression of the prior probability. And then the context part is giving us the conditional probability in Hale's terms. And we can do some interesting things. We can emulate some interesting effects with these kinds of models. So for example, if you are in a cafe and there's lots and lots of noisy speakers around, the word level input might be highly degraded. And so the activation function for different possible matching candidates, that might be more heavily driven by the context in that situation. So you might be more dependent on your contextual knowledge than you are on the bottom-up input itself. So we might call that the heavy prediction situation. There also can oftentimes be weak context. So one of the frequent critiques of the Bayesian information theoretic viewpoint is most of the time things are not really all that predictable. And so most of the contexts that we experience are actually pretty weak. So if there's a normative situation, it might be this one. And again, we can model that in this sort of simple architecture. So you have word level input. You don't really have anything from the context that causes you to rethink your estimate of prior probability. And so in this case, the activation function that falls out of the process might be more driven by the existing frequency statistics than by any sort of interaction with context. So that's useful. And there's a whole range of models, I think, that can accommodate this kind of dynamic change of bottom-up versus top-down processing. There's just a bunch of them. By contrast, so the Bayesian theoretic models are really focused on this part. How much time does it take us to process a word? And that's a function of the frequency of the word and the conditional probability in context. The discourse and dialogue models are also interested in that kind of stuff. So they also absolutely are interested in how words are processed and how syntactic structures are built. But the discourse and dialogue models also are very interested in this notion of selection. Once you have a range of candidates activated, different lexical representations, you have to select those aspects of the activated resonating memory traces that you actually need for this instance of interpretation. So after the activation period, you have to select from amongst the activated information and then integrate that with the context. And that process itself leads to updating of the context. So in a discourse processing model, yes, you have some word level inputs, things resonate, possibly based on association, possibly based on prior frequency statistics. But there's also this really important aspect of selection and integration. And those processes of selection and integration are influenced by context, and they also lead to the updating of the context information. And this points to another, I think, key difference between Bayesian information theoretic approaches and other approaches, and it's in the way they characterize context. In a information theoretic perspective, the context can just be a bag of words. As long as you have the right string of words, whether they make sense or not, if they're highly associated with a target word, you're going to see an impact on the activation function for that target word. So the context is really a pattern of associations, regardless of the meanings of those associations. In a discourse processing model, context really means a very different thing. Context is thought of more as things like events or situations, and they're described in modeling terms using concepts from guys like Johnson Laird in terms of how people model situations, how people build mental models for things like scenes or events. So the discourse processing models, when they talk about context, they lean heavily into situation models, simulation, emulation, and the Bayesian information-theoretic models. They really are not that interested in the events that are being depicted. They're interested in the way different linguistic units are associated to one another. This part I think we can skip over. Okay, so all of that brush clearing sets up a question, and the question is this: when we look at word level processing effects in experiments, are those a function of a pure function of prediction, anticipation, and association, or do those word processing events reflect discourse integration processes as well as other things? And now we can skip back to this. So all incremental interpretation models that I'm aware of would argue that all of this stuff happens on a word-by-word basis. So in sentence processing theories, almost without exception, I can't think of an exception, sentence processing theories argue that interpretation goes to the maximum depth possible as each word is encountered. So we're doing all of this stuff, for example, as we're reading, as each word arrives. We're not feeding in a ton of words and waiting and then doing a bunch of extra work. Okay. So I think we can reasonably ask the question, what does incremental interpretation include? If we're coming from a Bayesian perspective, it might include just the simple activation functions. As long as we can activate and recognize the word, we're okay. From a discourse processing, dialogue, model theoretic space, we really have to worry about integration as well. Okay, so that leads me to what I want to call the brothers paradigm after the brilliant Trevor brothers. And we'll talk about what this is in just a second. But first, the goal of this experiment, the goal of the brothers paradigm, was really to try to identify which effects in an experiment are driven by prediction versus which effects in an experiment are driven by integration. This was a long-standing theoretical debate and an interpretive debate in psycholinguistics. And Trevor, in my mind, is the person who really solved it. So I want to recognize that because I think this is actually kind of a very interesting and important study. Okay, so Trevor came to Davis and he already had this design worked out and he presented it to me and I said, Trevor, that is brilliant. We need to run this as soon as we can. And the design goes like this. Trevor crafted a number of discourse contexts that made certain lexical predictions about equally likely. So in this context, the author was writing another chapter about the fictional detective. To date, he thinks it will be his most popular. It's about 50% likely that the next word is novel. To date, he thinks it will be his most popular novel. And it's about 50% likely that the next word will be, to date, he thinks it will be his most popular book. Okay, so that's one context. It's a medium constraining, medium closed context where there are two completions of the context that are about equally likely, about 50% one way, about 50% the other way. In another condition, the low close condition, Trevor designed this so that the sentence that carries the target, that was the same across these conditions. But he manipulated the prior context to change the likelihood of the completion. So in the low close condition, the context sentence was, everyone congratulated the chef on all his hard work. Then we had this carrier phrase, to date, he thinks it will be his most popular. And that makes it very, very unlikely that the word novel will appear, less than 1% close. Okay. So we have three different sort of conditions here. And every condition concludes with the same target word. Target word is always the word novel. We presented participants in this experiment with the discourse context all at the same time, and subjects read that discourse context. We then presented the target sentence one word at a time in the middle of the computer screen, RSVP presentation. And then we presented them with the target word novel in each condition. After people had processed that target sentence, we asked them, did you predict that word or did you predict a different word? We encouraged them as part of the task instructions of the experiment to try to predict the target words. Okay. And so we wind up with three conditions. Half the time in the medium close situation, the participants succeeded in predicting the actual target word. The other half of the time in that situation, they failed to predict the target word. They probably predicted something else that was related. And then in the low close condition, it's just impossible to accurately predict the target word. So you have an unpredicted word. The combination of these conditions gives us two different contrasts that we can look at. One contrast is words that are successfully predicted versus unpredicted. So we can use that contrast to get at prediction effects for medium likelihood words. And then the other contrast gives us two unpredicted words, one of which is pretty good fit for its context, and one of which would be a less good fit for the context. And we can use this to get at integration effects. And then the question is, on what time course do these effects occur? If all processing takes place just by a pure association and resonance, we should see all of the effects emerging in the same time span. If, as Kinch suggested, there is an internal structure to the language processing system such that resonance and activation happens first, followed by selection and integration, we might see these prediction effects and the integration effects happening in different timescales. And in fact, to give away the punchline, that's what we found. The way we found it, the way Trevor found it, using Trevor's data, he took people into the EEG ERP lab. He measured their brain waves as they were going through this It was a good time for a break anyway. Come on now.
Sorry for any technical difficulties.
Sorry about that. The internet has been a little squirrely today. So sharing screen again. This happens from time to time. Share. Skipping down. Okay. Long story short. Trevor, does that show up okay on your end?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
You can do full screen.
I would like to do full screen.
Okay, don't.
But I'm not sure if I can. Maybe if we go from beginning. No, hang one sec. Let me redo this. There we go. Okay, so long story short, Trevor's ERP experiment very cleverly showed that in fact, when we look at the two prediction conditions, so medium closed sentences, successful versus unsuccessful prediction, there's an early ERP effect about 200 to 250 milliseconds following presentation of the target word. And when we look for the integration effect, so words that were unsuccessfully predicted, one of which was easy to integrate, one of which was hard to integrate, those effects emerge later in the typical sort of N400, 300 to 500 milliseconds post-stimulus. So this experiment was, as far as I'm aware, it was the first to cleanly differentiate between effects of prediction and effects of integration. And rather than being completely overlapping in time, the two effects are temporally separable, with prediction effects occurring prior to integration effects, which is, I think, consistent with what Kinch would have anticipated. So we conclude from results like that we do have separable mental events in interpretation, early prediction effects, possibly based on information-theoretic principles of association and resonance. You know, that's I think a viable hypothesis. But other word processing effects happening due to integration effects. So at a minimum, we think you need an interpretation model that has at least two factors, one of which relates to processes of activation influenced by context, and another set of processes temporally later that we would describe as selection and integration. Okay, so that's kind of a summary of where we stand with regards to integration and prediction. There's a whole nother set of interesting issues that comes out of the information-theoretic point of view, and perhaps ungenerously, you could characterize the question like this. As language understanders, as comprehenders, are we essentially reflexive pattern associators? Are we resonance machines? Or are we actually a little bit more subtle than that? So in asking how context impacts activation functions, are we just reflexively responding to prior experience and frequency information? Or are we a little bit fancier than that? Okay? And why might we think that we're a little bit fancier than just pure pattern associators? There's three areas of evidence that I think we could appeal to. One relates to experiments on affordance in the Gibsonian perceptual sense versus association. Another, it relates to how syntax affects word processing and meaning interpretation. And the third is in the area of vocabulary development. And so starting with affordance versus of association, we actually can pit a theory of semantic interpretation that relies on embodied concepts versus a theory that just relates to association implemented in models like Hale and LSA. And those two approaches, does embodiment matter, or is word processing and interpretation simply a function of association as per LSA? My old friend Dave Robertson and Art Glenberg did a set of experiments where they held association constant and they manipulated the contextual affordance in the Gibsonian sense. So if you read a sentence like this, to make a pillow, the camper filled up an old sweater with leaves. If you simulate or emulate that event using embodied systems, that is an afforded situation. You actually could physically fill a sweater with leaves and stick it behind your head, and that would be better than nothing. To contrast with that, they had a non-afforded condition, started the same way. To make a pillow, the camper filled up an old sweater with water. This is non-afforded. This can't happen in the normal. So we have a situation that's afforded and a situation that's not afforded by the physical properties of the objects that are mentioned in the sentence. What Glenberg and Robertson did is they held the association between the prior context and the keyword. They held that constant across the two conditions. So leaves is just as associated with the prior context as is water. Neither one of them has an advantage in terms of association. As such, neither one of them should have an advantage in an activation function that's driven just by association, okay? And they had different dependent measures. They used plausibility judgment in some studies. They used reading times in others, and the results were consistent. The afforded conditions had an advantage over the non-afforded conditions in reading time and in plausibility judgment. And that's simply not explicable on a pure association viewpoint. Another area where we can investigate association versus something else, in this case it's syntactic structure building operations, is in studies like Robin Morris's. This is another eye tracking study. And in her case, again, she held the association of context to some critical words in her sentences. She held the association constant, and then she manipulated the way the syntax governed the semantic interpretation that people assign to the different arguments. So in sentence one, the barber who watched the gardener trimmed the bushes. The gardener trimmed the bushes has a really high association value, but it's not the gardener, according to the syntax, who's trimming the bushes. It's actually the barber. Okay? And so if we replace bushes with mustache, in either case, it's the barber who's the agent of the trimming action. Okay? But the association is held constant. And so if association is what matters, the gardener trimmed the bushes should have an advantage over gardener trimmed the mustache. And in fact, that's not what happens. What happens is if it's the barber who's doing the trimming, mustache has the advantage, bushes has a disadvantage. So in this case, we didn't do it. Robin Morris did it. She controlled the association between the left-hand context and some critical part of the sentence and manipulated the meaning that people assign to the expression based on the syntax, and found that it was the syntax that was driving the effects, not association. And then finally, these are some kind of cute studies. When little kids learn word meanings, there's a common sort of folk idea that kids are learning word meanings by associating sounds with concepts. And in fact, we've known since Quine that you really can't solve the meaning derivation problem. You can't assign meanings to words just by using straight association. In fact, there's lots of data suggesting that little kids, they don't just associate sounds and meanings or sounds and visual objects. They're actually sort of sophisticated little thinkers. And here's an example of a kind of experiment that demonstrates this phenomenon. So imagine that you're a little kid in an experiment and someone holds up something like this, and you already know. So you bring in little kids who already know that this thing is called fish. Okay. Now you have three different kinds of speakers that different kids are exposed to. Speaker A, let's call that speaker reliable. You hold up this object and speaker A says, "Oh, what a pretty fish. That's a nice fish. Where did you get that fish?" Okay. So that's a reliable speaker. He's using the label that the child already knows for a familiar object. Speaker B is unreliable. Hold up the same object and speaker B says something like, "Ooh, look at the dog. What a nice dog. Isn't that a great dog?" So speaker B is unreliable. In some of these studies, speaker C is actually blindfolded when someone holds up an object. And speaker C goes ahead and says, "Oh, what a nice dog. That's a great dog. What a pretty dog." So we have two kinds of unreliable speakers and one reliable speaker. And the question is, what happens to the child when you introduce them to a new object that's labeled by these same speakers? So you bring in a new object after kids have been exposed to the speaker, and the speaker labels the object, and they all give it the same label. Everybody says, "This is a blicket." Speaker A, blicket, B, blicket, C, blicket. And the question is, do the kids just reflexively associate this word with this object? Are they just doing pattern association, sound to visual object? The answer is no, they don't. Kids, if you ask them later, "What is this thing called? What do you remember about the name of this thing?" The kids who listen to the reliable speaker will call this thing a blicket, and kids who listen to the other speakers won't. Okay? They are assessing the reliability of the speaker as they are determining whether to attach a chunk of phonology to a visual object. There's many other studies in this vein in the child vocabulary acquisition literature. It turns out that children are sensitive to a range of different factors when they are assigning labels to concepts, labels to objects. As in this study, individual speakers' history of accuracy matters. If a speaker expresses uncertainty, that matters. The speaker's age matters to kids, their accent, physical appearance, other social cues. All of these things mediate the relationship between a speaker labeling an object, "Hey, that's a nice blicket," and the child's willingness to adopt that label and remember it going forward. Okay, so the punchline here is nicely expressed in the title of this paper by Koenig and Harris: preschoolers mistrust ignorant and inaccurate speakers. They don't just reflexively associate chunks of phonology to concepts. And then so I think we need to ask the question in a separate study, what's going on with adults and their willingness to mistrust or trust ignorant and inaccurate speakers. That's a talk for another day. Okay, so we got interested in this aspect of association and language processing, and so we designed a set of studies to manipulate speaker reliability. And so to do this, we presented target words that were either in predictable or unpredictable contexts. So for example, Eric sued the taxi driver and took him to. The word court is highly predictable in this context. And in a different condition, we embedded that same target word in a different context that was much more neutral. So Eric picked up his friend and took him to. Court is certainly a plausible continuation, but it's not predictable. Okay, so we have some predictable sentences with critical target words embedded, and some unpredictable or less predictable sentences. These sentences were recorded by two speakers, one with a male voice, one with a female voice, and then we fully counterbalanced the study so that all of the factors weren't confounded, say, with speaker gender. Okay, so we have a predictability factor, predictable versus unpredictable. And we took these kinds of sentences and we embedded them in different kinds of experiment-wide global contexts. In one experiment-wide global context, the critical speaker was pretty highly reliable, pretty much always completed the sentences with predictable words. And in another condition, the unreliable global context, the same speaker would frequently say things that were unpredictable. So that would be the contrast between this. So in one of the global conditions, we manipulated the filler sentences so that one speaker was highly reliable, 80% predictable overall, or unreliable, 20% predictable overall. To do that, we had different versions of the filler sentences. So in the reliable speaker, they might start by saying the passenger ship Titanic hit the iceberg and began to. They would continue that with a highly predictable word like sink. So that makes the speaker reliable because they're behaving in a predictable fashion. In the other condition, that speaker would be unreliable or unpredictable. So with the same filler sentence, instead of saying the ship hit the iceberg and began to sink, they would say the ship hit the iceberg and began to tilt. So all of our target sentences are locally identical. Eric sued the taxi driver and took him to court. That appears whether the speaker is reliable or unreliable. Okay? And then we contrast that with Eric picked up his friend and took him to court where it's unpredictable. So in this experiment, we have two factors. We have a predictability factor. A target word is either predictable or unpredictable in its local context. And then we have a reliability factor. Overall, the speaker is highly predictable versus unpredictable. So we got a 2x2 design, predictability by reliability. In the Bayesian information-theoretic viewpoint, we shouldn't get any effective speaker reliability because the association strength between the target word and its immediate context is the same. It's either highly associated or not, highly predictable or it's not. And so we shouldn't see any effect of speaker reliability. If instead people are a little more flexible in their cognition, if people are dynamically adapting to things like speaker characteristics, which we know they do for things like speaking speed or accent, if people are similarly flexible in their interpretive processes, we should very well see effects of both predictability in terms of the local context and reliability in terms of the wider global context. And that's in fact exactly what, again, Trevor and his lab mates found. So again, we're using EEG ERP to evaluate how people respond to their critical words. And what we find is here is the predictable words, and they produce a smaller N400. So there's your predictability effect. This is the unpredictable word, produces a much bigger effect around about N400 period. But the size of that effect in college age listeners anyway, the size of that predictability effect is modulated by reliability. So when the speaker is unreliable, the difference between the predictable and unpredictable conditions gets much lower. And in fact, if you eyeball this, what seems to be happening is the nice N400 advantage you get for the predictable target words. That's shifted upwards when the speaker is unreliable. And here's a difference way of just showing that the difference between the reliable and unreliable speaker in terms of the size of the predictability effect, and then it's kind of centered in this standard N400 posterior space on the skull. And this is the same thing sort of graphically represented. That's the difference in the predictability, predictable versus unpredictable for the reliable speakers. There's still a predictability effect for the unreliable speaker. It's just smaller. We've also just very recently run this same paradigm on older folks, 65 and up. And the paradigm is the same. So we have predictable versus unpredictable target words, crossed with a reliable versus an unreliable speaker, both the younger and the older adults show a predictability effect. So there's an advantage for predictable words over unpredictable words. But there appears to be a difference. In fact, there's an interaction between age, so older versus younger, and the magnitude of the speaker reliability effect. So again, for the young people, we replicated the big difference between predictable and unpredictable target words for the reliable speaker with a smaller effect in young folks for the unreliable speaker. And in the older adults, they don't show a difference in terms of the predictability effect between the reliable and unreliable speaker. Okay. So the story about cognitive flexibility and adaptation might be we have more of it when we're young, and as we get older and set in our ways, we are adjusting less dynamically on the fly to aspects of speaker properties. All right, this talk has gone on for a very long time. And so I just briefly want to say that we have a similar evidence for adaptation to global context using self-paced reading, where again, we manipulate predictability and kind of the reliability of the global context. That's again, another study by Trevor. And then just before I conclude, I want to give a very quick plug to the Gina Cooperberg lab, and in particularly Samer Eddine, who has done some really good and sophisticated modeling work that I think takes very seriously the notion that language is about understanding events, and also takes very seriously that we can have multiple processes running sequentially, potentially. So activation and integration. So both bottom-up information matters in this model, top-down contextual information matters, and it matters at different levels of analysis, so orthographic, word level, and meaning level. And so as people are interested in this kind of thing, I highly recommend that you go take a look at some of the Cooperberg Group's publications on anticipatory processing, event representations, how context information is combined with bottom-up signal information in order to produce a whole range of different effects, including response times, including things like patterns that we see in EEG ERP experiments. So that's just a quick advertisement more than an explanation, but I find Gina's work and the group's work to be particularly compelling and interesting. So if you're interested in anticipatory processing, bottom-up, top-down processing, activation, integration type stuff, go for sure take a look at the Cooperberg group's work. Okay, and then to finish up, I think there are some general conclusions that we can draw in terms of our research questions. How and when do listeners make predictions about upcoming language stimuli? What factors contribute to processing difficulty? And how do readers make use of contextual information? I think the short answer is, in terms of how we make predictions and how we process words and what contributes to word level processing load, it's a function of the combination of contextual top-down information and signal-related bottom-up information. And the how of it is that listeners and readers take into consideration global contextual information, not just the local sentence context, not just the recent n-gram associations, but rather they can take into consideration a much wider set of recent inputs. So readers and listeners are taking into consideration global contextual and speaker-specific information in order to weight the influence of local context, prior associations versus bottom-up information flow as these activation functions are being generated. Okay, so that's number A. Number B is I still think our language interpretation models have to include a process of integration. I don't think we can have a one-step model that just says we feed information in, there's resonance between top-down, bottom-up influences. I still think that there's a place for selection and integration processes in describing how humans assign meaning to input. And then second part of conclusion B is we are not simply reflexive pattern associators in the pure sense. Instead, our cognition is a little bit more flexible, and how exactly that works, I think, is an area certainly open for future research and future discussion. And then just to, except maybe this guy, not sure about him. To finish off, just want to say thank you to all the wonderful members of the lab, especially Tamara, Trevor, Levy, and Shruti, who did the work in the studies that I just presented to you today, and the rest of the wonderful students in the lab at UC Davis.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Matt.
Thanks, Trevor.
I think we'll have time for a couple questions. So first, you talked a lot about the flexibility of predictive processing. I just wanted you to talk a little bit about to what extent do you think this top-down pre-activation is an optional or obligatory component of language comprehension. So someone like Falk-Huttig might argue anticipating is totally optional. We can still understand a sentence even if we're not pre-activating at all, even though that might be a little less efficient under some circumstances. Whereas according to some really strong predictive coding theories, you might argue perception is prediction, and in order to pass messages up the brain, we have to be constantly generating these top-down reconstructions of what we think we're going to see next. So just wanted to get your intuitions on that.
So there's multiple possible ways to answer that. One is I think Falk has done some really excellent work looking at different kinds of listeners and speakers, and finds evidence that the kinds of anticipatory phenomena we observe in college student, highly literate college students, those may not apply across the board when we go look at speakers, for example, who are not literate and not practiced in the way American, Western European college students are heavily practiced on literacy skills. So that's one piece of it. Another piece of it is if people are interested, absolutely go and look at Falk's 2016 review, I think, where he describes the basis for his idea that prediction may happen, but it may very well be optional. Now, in terms of empirically, it seems like the standard experimental paradigm where we investigate prediction heavily biases, heavily stacks the deck in favor of prediction taking place. So in things like ERP experiments, the standard pace of presentation of words to which we're measuring ERP signals is pretty slow compared to the average speaking rate of the average person. And if prediction is both optional and strategic, the more time you give people, the more likely it is that they're going to come up with a prediction. And this is something we're actually studying in the lab right now. Agnes Gao has come up with a new paradigm where we're actually manipulating whether people are successfully able to produce verbally a predicted word. So now we can compare not just prediction success versus failure, we can contrast prediction success, prediction failure, and cases where you couldn't successfully predict at all in a given time frame. So there's that, and we know that timing functions matter. So there's lots of experimental work from labs like Paula Schwanenflugel's older stuff, where there are clear effects of contextual constraint on the response to target words. But critically, that matters on how much time you let elapse between the end of a carrier phrase and the onset of a target word. So whether prediction is obligatory, I think, is an empirical question. And I'm quite willing to accept the idea that predictive coding says we have to do it. If we have to do it, then it should be observed, even in cases where prediction should be difficult.
And so if you can get situations for prediction to disappear, those are the most interesting edge cases for actually testing that theory.
Right on. See, I knew you guys were on this.
So another one, so you talked a lot about the consequences of predictive processing during word perception while you're reading sentences, but there's also this kind of prominent idea in psycholinguistics about using prediction errors for long-term learning.
Mm-hmm.
So if you can just talk about that a little bit, and especially in really young children, where you have a situation kind of like your unreliable speaker context, maybe with less language proficiency, you might not be good at predicting upcoming content, but those incorrect predictions might be really informative. Yeah,
so, and I don't want to do disservice to the worldview that talks about error correction learning as being a really important piece of how we develop linguistic knowledge in the first place. And so Chang's work on syntactic prediction, syntactic error, and how that relates to child language acquisition, I think is really interesting, and people should definitely go look at. And in addition, there's work by folks like Anne Fernald, where we know that the opportunity to practice really, really matters in terms of children's vocabulary development. The more learning trials a child has, the faster they are to recognize words that are in their familiar vocabulary. And then Fernald demonstrates, I think, very elegantly that the faster you can process and recognize those familiar items, the more attention you have to distribute to parts of the language signal that you don't know yet. Now, whether that requires error correction, I think is a separate issue. And one question I've always had about that approach is, how does a kid know that there's an error, right? Where does the error signal come from? If there's some part of the system that is smart enough to know that there's been an error, why didn't that part of the system just do the interpretive process in the first place? So again, there's lots of sophisticated modeling work done by people that I very much respect, but I do think there's some open questions, and I'm not certain that learning by error correction is the only game in town. I'm less familiar with unsupervised learning algorithms. I understand that they're out there and that they don't rely on this anticipation, comparison of the forward model with the actual stimulus, a judgment of the difference between those two things, which then propagates back to influence the next trial. I know that you folks are really interested in that in your models, and I think your models are very compelling. So I want to stay agnostic on that one.
That's fair. And one last one, I guess there's this idea of using context to not just inform, but actually pre-activate these state units, representations at lower linguistic levels. And kind of one of the standard critiques of predictive processing is not only are predictions sometimes going to be wrong, if you're actually doing pre-activation, you might be producing incorrect hallucinations at these lower levels of representation. So you have a figure up there with orthography and semantics and visual information. So just wondering, how far down do you think predictions go in the linguistic system?
I think there is actual evidence for auditory hallucinations, if you want to describe them that way. So there's very old work by Steve Izzard, where you delete part of the signal, you place that in context, and people will not just make a sensible contextual interpretation. If you ask them, what did you hear? They will actually mentally insert missing phonology. So the classic study is the settlers were upset when the wagon lost its blank E. So the signal is just eel. That's one condition. In another condition, it was the chimpanzee was upset because his banana had a brown, same exact eel, and people will report that they hear wheel in the first case and peel in the second case. So I think there is some empirical evidence, and I don't know if that's pre-activation though. That may be a consequence of the need to reconcile in integration a degraded signal with the carrier phrase. So, but it's very intriguing, right? So if I am going through that context and I am using my knowledge of the relevant events in order to anticipate and pre-activate potential upcoming concepts or objects, if that does reach all the way down to phonology, yeah, that would lead to an auditory hallucination. But how is that different than what we're doing in a noisy bar, where we're taking those parts of the signal that we can get, and then we're kind of mentally filling in? In vision, you get these pattern completion effects when stuff is in the blind spot. And people don't just say, well, it makes sense that the checkerboard would continue because of the context. They actually visually perceive the continuation of the pattern. So there's that. Shoot, there was one other thing I wanted to say about that. Now I'm losing the thought. It's gone now.
But yeah, I agree. That's an interesting question. And it's hard just from self-report after the effect to really know at the moment you're hearing pa or wa in peel or wheel, whether
yes. And so I think that's, yeah, absolutely. Again, I think this is an empirical question. I think Pickering and Gambi's analysis of this, where they do this really nice review paper and they walk through different kinds of evidence for anticipatory processes. And they argue for a specific mechanism of prediction, the production system. And one of their concerns that they express in that paper is they did a thorough evaluation of the evidence from the experimental literature, and they didn't really see anything that was knockdown, drag out evidence for pre-activation per se. So what we need are paradigms that can illuminate the process of prediction or anticipation while it's happening, just like we needed a paradigm to differentiate between prediction and integration. But if we do predict, I don't think this is any strange or exotic idea. I think we have different candidate mechanisms for it. And whether there's one predictive mechanism or multiples, I think that's an open question. So can we predict using the production system? I think absolutely. If we have an event representation and we have a verbal description of some piece, and I think Gina would say this too, if we have a verbal description of one piece of that event, if we have something like a schema that ties different concepts together, well, if I activate that schema, it's an organized package of information in long-term memory such that when I activate one part of it, other parts of it are going to come along for the ride. And again, this isn't new or exotic. Garrett and Sanford talked about this in the context of implicit versus explicit focus, again in a model of discourse processing, and found evidence that yes, indeed, when we have pre-organized schematic knowledge, there are some elements of those schematic packages that will be at a much higher level of accessibility or activation. They're in explicit focus. There are different focus operators in language that we can use to regulate the degree of accessibility or activation. And then there's other things that are kind of sitting there. They're not completely suppressed or inactive as per normal, but they haven't risen to the level of high accessibility. And that in addition could be a prediction mechanism. So implicit focus, if we can define exactly how that works, that can give us another mechanism that would lead to anticipation. But the question of how it's done, I think you've identified it perfectly. It's a separate question from when it's done and is it always done.
And one last question from the chat. How do you think these models of predictive processing can be adapted to accommodate knowledge of more than one language, multilinguals and bilinguals?
Oh, that is a really good question. And I think it probably relates to at what level anticipation is working. So you could imagine that we are anticipating based on event knowledge or schematic knowledge that I'm likely to mention. What would be a good example? In the example of the type, no, that's not a good, something that ends with a noun. The elderly couple had a really nice pet, and tonight when they were at home, they decided to go for a walk with their dog. So say, dog is highly predictable from the event schema, and that was a bad example, but think of a much better example where the target word is dog, okay? You could imagine that a bilingual speaker can activate that schematic knowledge independent of the specific verbal labels. And so if we had a paradigm that's really just getting at conceptual activation, a bilingual should perform pretty much like everybody else. If, however, we have a really good paradigm that is assessing the degree to which phonology is activated, we might expect the bilingual speaker to experience maybe some cross-language interference, depending on multiple factors like degree of proficiency, which specific languages they know, language dominance in their current living situation, et cetera, et cetera. So I think Gina's model may actually be able to handle this in an elegant way, where you would expect the event anticipation, the conceptual activations or pre-activations, they should work the same, I think, across different speakers, whether they know.
I think Matt was going to finish with multiple languages or one.
Languages. But when we prediction, I'm unstable, it says.
No, we got
I'm not surprised.
Okay. Awesome. I think that's a good place to stop. Thank you again for an awesome presentation, Matt, and thank you everybody for listening. Remember, check out future talks that will be happening soon at the Oberlin website, and there's a wonderful backlog of great talks from this series, all stored on YouTube, so go through and check the archives, and everyone have a good rest of their evening.